Studies and Associate Professor for Economics and East European Studies at Freie Universität Berlin, to welcome you. Thank you to Misa for the wonderful invitation and for the moderation of this wonderful seminar. So I have the honor to present you Professor Charles Kalomiris. Professor Kalomiris is the Henry Kaufman Professor Emeritus of financial institutions at Columbia Business School, and also Professor Emeritus of International and Public Affairs at the School of International and Public Affairs, both at Columbia University. Professor Calomiris is a leading expert in banking, corporate finance, financial history, and monetary economics, and he is famous for his work on the political and institutional origins of financial systems. He has directed Columbia's Program for Financial Studies Initiative on Finance and Growth with a focus on emerging markets. He has been a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution, an associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he has been holding several leading professional memberships in the economics profession. His book, Fragile by Design, The Political Origins of Banking Panics and Scarce Credit, has been also a book that has been very influential, both for me personally, if I'm allowed to say, but also for several researchers around the globe that have an interest in political economy and financial systems. Professor Calomiris is going to talk to us today on Friedman's Maxim and the theory and history of inflation. Professor Calomiris, thank you for joining us at the Moldovan School of Economics. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Theocharis, and thanks to all of you for your presence here today, and thanks for the warm introduction. When I was talking with people about what topic to pick for today, it was clear that the right choice is something that was, let's say, big picture. That is something that tries to take on big questions. And the big question that's behind the lecture that I prepared is what's going on with inflation, right? So that's a very broad historical topic. And also, how do we think about the role of money in understanding what's going on with inflation? And I decided to start with Friedman's Maxim because I think it's very well known, and because I think it does have some important insights about the theory and history of inflation. But I also think that in many ways, it is not the end of the story, and in fact, is like most maxims, a bit empty in that we need to fill in a lot and qualify a lot. And so that's an introduction to how we decided on this topic. So let me just begin. The great economist Milton Friedman, of course, famously said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And in trying to understand that, I would say it's surely correct in the narrow sense, in the following sense. In a fiat money regime, the government has a monopoly on the supply of money. If it wanted single-mindedly to achieve any particular price level or any particular exchange rate, if that's all it wanted to achieve, it certainly could vary the supply of money that it has a monopoly over to achieve any price level or exchange rate. And Friedman himself sometimes spoke this way, that we know that money is the essence of price determination or inflation in a sort of counterfactual sense, that we know that if you have the monopoly over the production of it, you can set the price. And I think that is not a controversial statement, but a few points of clarification are needed. So first, notice that that's not the same as saying that variation in the supply of money causes variation in prices in our actual experience. So for example, under the classical gold standard, prices were largely predetermined by the established parity of the monetary unit with a certain amount of gold. The money supply responded to that parity that was established. And so under the gold standard, you might more accurately say that the price level which was determined by the parity, determined the money supply. And in a lot of my research, in fact, even in my dissertation, I found that more generally, it's often the case that the money supply is itself determined by other influences. So in general, it's not very helpful to think that the money supply is causing inflation, because the money supply is itself determined by other influences. So I think that we have to be careful about causation. For that reason, you might say Friedman's maxim inherently leaves unanswered a central question, maybe the central question of interest. Why do some countries seem to have so much more trouble with inflation than others? That's a causal question. Why do some countries suffer from high inflation and highly volatile inflation? The two tend to go together, while others enjoy low inflation and low inflation volatility. Why should their monetary phenomena of inflation be so different? And I do want to spend a lot of time on those causal questions today. I also want to note another caveat to the Friedman maxim. It shouldn't be misunderstood to say that the exchange rate or the price level of a country always move in lockstep with the current outstanding amount of money. So that's a statement about close correlation, not about causation. That is, it's sometimes true that they don't move in lockstep with each other. And when thinking about that fact, I want to point to three sets of reasons why they don't tend to move in lockstep. So first, there can be fundamental instability in what's called real demand for money. So that the real demand for money is the ratio of nominal money divided by the price level that people actually want to hold to execute their transactions or to serve as a store of value for them. And sometimes that function's not stable. That is, people don't really have a very clearly defined real demand for money that is correlated with obvious observables, like GDP, let's say, or even the total amount of transactions. In recent years, central banks really aren't using the amount of money as a reliable predictor of P, that is price level, or exchange rates, mainly because they don't really believe the demand for money is very stable. And partly that's the result of the growing importance of very volatile demands for money for financial transactions in securities markets in particular. And so I think it's fair to say that the close correspondence between M and P, money just as a predictor of price, contemporaneous or lagged, is weak, partly because there's a lot of instability in the demand function. A second reason why the two don't move in lockstep is that the ratio of M over P can vary predictably as a result of expected future money growth. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. This was a subject of some of my dissertation. When expected money growth is, let's say, high, people are expecting a lot of growth in money, prices might begin to rise even before that expected money supply growth materializes as a result of the fact that people are expecting it. So we know under the standard formulation of money demand in the macro literature that money demand depends negatively on the rate of inflation. And that means that if something happened to make you expect that there was going to be a lot of money growth that was going to be associated with inflation, your money demand might fall immediately. The observable influence that usually leads to this very rapid and predictable money supply growth is most frequently growth in fiscal spending. Things seem to have changed. Can you still hear me? I'm sorry. I don't see the same picture I was seeing a minute ago.
Yeah, we hear.
Okay, good. So the observable influence that's most important for this idea of sort of expecting lots of money growth and inflation that leads to an immediate decline in real money demand and therefore a jump in the price level and the exchange rate. The main influence that we can observe that has that effect is growth in government debt. That is, big growth in expected deficits and their monetization. That is the belief that governments are going to be spending a lot of money, they're going to fund it with deficits, and that they're going to choose to monetize those deficits. In history, when we see that kind of thing happening, it is true that we tend to see prices and exchange rates adjusting immediately, even before the money stock has changed. By the way, Friedman himself was aware of this. He was a historian of money, and he noted early in his career that the best way to really ensure inflation stability was for the government to adhere to a government debt growth rule. So many of you may know about Friedman's later discussion of wanting to have a money growth rule. But in the 1950s, he realized that government debt growth was really the most important thing, that keeping government debt from growing out of bounds would itself basically prevent the money supply from having to grow out of bounds. Brazil's experience with inflation in the 1970s is what I want to talk a little bit about from the standpoint of this idea that a fiscal growth in debt that you can predictably see connected to deficits ongoing in the future and the decision to monetize them, that is, for the deficits to be directly linked to increases in the money supply. That was the subject of part of my PhD dissertation. Actually, I began studying Brazil in the 1970s as a summer intern at the IMF in 1981. And what I ended up concluding in my Journal of Money and Credit Banking paper was that fiscal shocks were in Brazil driving both money growth and inflation. The two weren't moving together in lockstep because the fiscal shocks had predictable consequences on inflation and money growth, and that when a fiscal shock was observable, prices immediately rose even before the money stock rose. And then eventually, the money stock would catch up to prices. And actually, my assignment at the IMF in the summer of 1981 was to understand why in Brazil, price increases tended to predict money growth, not vice versa. And why the real money demand in Brazil was falling so dramatically. So why don't we pull up that first graph of Brazilian inflation and real money balances. So inflation was accelerating during the 1970s and had reached more than 100% by the end of this time period. So if you pull up that first graph, you'll see a big decline in the log of real balances. So to translate this back into just simple real balances, if there's a 50% decline in the ratio of money supply over prices. So when I was hired at the IMF, they said, well, please explain two things. Why is it that prices tend to precede money in forecasting? That is, money isn't useful for forecasting prices, but prices or exchange rates are useful for forecasting money. And secondly, why is real money demand falling so much? So the answer that I found in my research was that observable changes in prices and exchange rates were reacting to deficits which were routinely and predictably monetized, so that when the government increased its deficits, which are observable in terms of an increase in outstanding public debt, government debt, you immediately saw a price reaction. And then later, as those deficits became predictably monetized, that is, money printing happened predictably, the money growth increased. So it was the shock to government debt that caused prices and exchange rates to jump, and then eventually monetization of debt occurred and money happened subsequently. So money stock growth trailed price exchange rate effects, but all three were causally driven by government deficits. By the way, IMF staff were well aware that price level changes, inflation, is generally the result of causation coming from spending growth. In fact, an internal joke at the IMF is that its initials actually stand for the phrase, "it's mainly fiscal." In other words, inflation, exchange rate changes, which are central to the IMF's, of course, charter to try to figure out how to manage orderly exchange rates across countries, that the thing that really disturbs that is mainly fiscal decisions by governments that have inflationary consequences. An interesting academic question, I think, is why do governments allow themselves to get into this trouble so often, where their fiscal shocks become forcing them to have high inflation? And in fact, if you look at the history of high inflations, what you'll find is that war is a common reason for very high inflations, especially hyperinflations. And if you're fighting a war, of course, the answer is you're not always able to control your expenditures. You're fighting a war, you kind of have to mobilize all your resources. There are political and economic limits on your current ability to tax. So a government often finds itself unable to control the growth in its debt, and sometimes have to use, because there are limits for the demand for the growth of real government debt. So when governments hit the upper bound of what the public is willing to absorb in real government debt, which is something we're going to return to later, when they hit that, they have to monetize. And of course, that monetization and the consequent inflation can be thought of as another kind of tax, which is sometimes called the inflation tax, because inflation causes citizens to lose wealth and the government to gain that wealth as a result of the erosion of the value of the government's money supply. So the government makes a capital gain, the holders of the money make a capital loss. That can even apply to government debt, not just the money. That is, the government makes a capital gain from inflation when the inflation tax, the increase in government spending, is not anticipated. In fact, by the way, there's a new book coming out by George Hall and Thomas Sargent, the Nobel laureate, that's going to show that in big increases in fiscal spending that result in big declines, big growth in government debt, and ultimately increases in inflation are associated with big and sudden declines in the value of real government debt. So often the most important part of the inflation tax is not just the erosion in the value of money, but the erosion in the value of the outstanding debt. By the way, Robert Eisner wrote a very influential book in the 1980s called How Real is the Federal Deficit, which was all about how this was true in the US in the 1970s, that the most important part of the inflation tax was the unanticipated decline in the real value of outstanding government debt as a result of inflation. So, of course, part of the story is fighting wars. But even in the absence of wars, governments may find it hard to control spending because it's often convenient to create inflation, at least in the short term, if they and their political allies benefit from spending and don't bear the immediate political costs that come from the future inflation that will result from their spending and the eventual monetization of the spending that, let's just admit it, it's the next government's problem. So governments, if they're myopic, and of course, if they're thinking about their current election cycle, they may often be myopic. They might choose to spend for political reasons, short-term political reasons, even at the expense of inflation and some long-term political consequences. So let's think about that from the standpoint of US history from the 1960s to the 1980s. Lyndon Johnson, who was our president in the 60s, for 6 years of the 60s, engaged in a spending spree that combined what was called Great Society domestic spending with the Vietnam War spending. And we're not at that graph quite yet, but thanks. And this was accommodated by the Federal Reserve, which produced money growth to purchase the increased government debt that resulted in accelerating inflation over more than a decade. And in fact, the combination of the initial influence in the 1960s and early 1970s of the Vietnam War and the Great Society on money growth, followed by the some later decisions we'll discuss having to do with oil shock reactions, produced what in the US is called the Great Inflation. So I want to emphasize, Johnson didn't really pay the political price for the inflation, partly because prices were slow to adjust to the monetary growth. Much of the political cost for the inflation was borne by the Nixon and Ford administrations, who tried to sort of pretend that it wasn't the result of the government spending and the monetization. And they tried to fight it with price controls. Believe it or not, the US, yes, in the 1970s, under Nixon and Ford, tried to use price controls, and in fact even argued that inflation was not the result of government actions. This did not work at all. And soon that was discredited. And then when the Carter administration came in and the Reagan administration, Jimmy Carter made the difficult political decision to appoint Paul Volcker as Fed chair, who was up front a disinflationary Fed chair who told Carter, and also told Reagan after him, that the only way to defeat the inflation was to reverse the government policies and to shrink the money supply. And he did that. Carter lost the election of 1980, partly because of the negative real growth caused by that inflation fighting. And Reagan almost lost his reelection in 1984 because of the recession that was caused by that continuing inflation fighting. So my point is that inflation can be convenient to spenders like Johnson and very unpopular, ultimately, and very costly to subsequent politicians once it arises and has to be dealt with. And the US history from the 1960s to 80s kind of shows that. So we can understand how inflation happens because the politicians who make the spending and monetization choices actually do get some benefits. So I also want to point the historical overview I just gave of the US and talking about Brazil a little bit points to something that I think is extremely important. The fact that we now have a consensus globally about something called flexible inflation targeting policy, that is, that we want to target low inflation, that central banks kind of agree that there are big benefits to targeting low inflation with flexible inflation targeting that allowed some countercyclical monetary policy, but is credibly targeting very low inflation. That doesn't mean that we're going to have low inflation, because central banks aren't the only ones in charge. Fiscal policy decisions are the main drivers of big inflations, because when governments create cumulatively a total amount of government debt that leads to the need to monetize that government debt, a situation which now in the literature is called fiscal dominance, which means that the decision about inflation is dominated by fiscal policy, not by inflation targeting decisions of central banks. So when fiscal dominance becomes a reality, then no matter what central banks say their targeting policy is, they're overwhelmed by this force majeure that is fiscal policy. We've seen this time and time again. The case of Brazil that I mentioned is one example. The case of the Great Society and Vietnam War was another example. And of course, as I'll mention in a minute, we're living through another time when the similar kinds of concerns arise. So no matter what the Federal Reserve tells us about its monetary policy, the big risk in the US of inflation is coming from fiscal policy. A third point about why the money supply and price levels don't always move in lockstep has to do with the exchange rate. So I like to think that there are two different definitions of inflation. One has to do with the domestic price level. The other has to do with your purchasing power in foreign countries. And that is captured by the exchange rate. And when you think about that other factor, the exchange rate, there's another influence that can produce a divergence between the money stock and domestic prices from the exchange rate. That has to do with productivity, relative productivity of your country's tradable goods production relative to your trading partners. So this is a theorem in international trade, which was kind of maybe first recognized by David Ricardo in the 19th century, later formalized by Herod, and finally by Ballas and Samuelson. And what they all showed is that if your country experiences low productivity growth in its tradable goods sector, that translates into what's called a real exchange rate depreciation. And that implies that for a given path of domestic prices, your exchange rate will have to depreciate relative to what it was in the past, relative to your trading partners. So inflation with respect to your foreign purchasing power reflects not just monetary policy decisions and fiscal influences, but it can be affected by this additional factor having to do with your productivity growth when we're talking just about inflation measured as your currency change or depreciation. To give you a little sense of that, if you look at the next graph, this is a graph I copied from my 2001 textbook on emerging markets. And what we're looking at here is various countries. I hope you can see it. Various countries, and on the horizontal axis, we are measuring their annual inflation rate, and on the vertical axis, we're measuring their currency devaluation rate, both over the period 1972 to 1996. So what we see is that some countries experienced what we call real exchange rate devaluation. Some countries experienced real exchange rate appreciation. So if you look at that 45-degree line, the countries that are to the right of that experienced inflation that was higher than their currency depreciation. We would say that they experienced real exchange rate appreciation. The countries to the left experienced depreciation that was greater than their domestic inflation. So from the standpoint of the Ballas-Samuelson theorem, we expect that those that are on the left side of the 45-degree line had lower productivity growth relative to their trading partners, whereas those on the right-hand side had higher productivity growth relative to their trading partners. So the key point is when we're comparing these two measures of inflation, exchange rate depreciation or domestic price level, we really think over certainly a reasonable period of time, like in this case 15 years, what we're expecting is what's driving that difference is productivity growth. Okay, so that completes our theoretical sort of summary of the things that we've learned from history and from economic theory about the influences we want to focus on, not just money supply policies, but fiscal policy and also productivity growth. So let's now look at the world today from the perspective of these observations. I would say when we're looking at countries like the US, Europe, China, and most other countries, what the big question that's facing them is, will they be able to rein in their spending to keep their government debt over GDP ratio from spiraling upward and out of control, forcing them to a major growth of their money supply and a major inflation. The main problem that's gripping countries all over the world has been safety net policies, and those are of two types. Most importantly, for most countries, health insurance and retirement benefits that governments provide have been ballooning. Again, governments have found it very politically beneficial to them to increase the generosity of those policies for political advantages. But in the long run, that has produced an unsustainable situation. In the US, I would say that we're sort of unsustainable to the tune of 4 percentage points of GDP per year in the steady state. That is, in order to make our fiscal policy sustainable, we would have to reduce our spending by about 4 percentage points of GDP forever. Another safety net policy that's created problems, especially for emerging market countries, has been safety net bailouts of the financial system, which in the late 20th century became a chronic contributor to ballooning government debts that produced inflation. So I just want to emphasize two different meanings of the word safety net. One having to do with safety net for the population, especially medical benefits and health problems in later life, and retirement benefits, but also financial safety nets that have can be very costly when you have to bail out your banking system. Banking bailouts have been major fiscal shocks in emerging markets, whereas the social safety nets for the population, health, and retirement have been much more of a problem for debt, government debt in the developed countries. Now, the reason that the shocks for the bank safety nets have been a bigger problem for emerging markets is that the potential for financial loss, the volatilities that affect financial loss, are a much greater fraction of their GDP. So bailout costs for emerging market countries, often in the 1990s and the early 2000s, were in excess of 20 percentage points of GDP. Whereas in, let's say, the global financial crisis that started in the US had a bailout cost for the US of less than 3% of GDP. So I just want to emphasize, we can make a kind of general statement that social safety net programs for retirement and health problems are the bigger problem for developed countries, whereas for emerging market countries, we can say that at least in the past, it's not obvious it will continue into the future, that it's big banking system bailouts in countries like Chile in 1982-83, Mexico 1994-95, East Asia 1997, Argentina, but we could go on and on, many examples of very large fiscal costs. Today, when we're thinking about the developed countries, the ones that are the most worrisome are, I would say, the US and France. They're the most prominent examples of not just the cumulative growth in government debt to the point where they are already at an unsustainable position, but then on an ongoing basis, a political unwillingness to make the spending cuts that are needed to put them back on a sustainable path. And so when you're looking, it's well known that when you look at the US or France, you say, well, if they don't make major changes to policy very quickly, their debt to GDP, which is already in both countries in excess of 100%, is going to go off to infinity. And of course, it can't go off to infinity, which is why it will produce instead, through fiscal dominance, a monetization, which will result in a big inflation. Now, the fundamental arithmetic of debt unsustainability isn't complicated. So let's just illustrate it with a simple example. Consider a case where the government debt to GDP has reached 100%. So that's true for the US. I also want to emphasize, you have to calculate this on a market value. That is, in the US, the market value of its outstanding debt is a little bit less than the face value of its outstanding debt. But on a market value basis, the US has reached 100%. And France has also reached 100% in excess of it. So now, suppose that you're looking at a country that's reached that 100% point. And let's also suppose, just for our hypothetical country, that their current rate of inflation is 0. Let's also suppose that the government isn't going to even spend or tax anything more in the future. So there's not going to be any more primary government spending, that the only thing the government is going to spend on, let's just, for simplicity, say there's not going to be any taxation and there's not going to be any government spending except to pay interest on its debt. So you can see how these explosive paths happen. So let's say that the real interest rate, this economy has 0 inflation, it's at a 100% debt to GDP ratio, and let's say it's not expecting to spend any more except on interest payments, it's not expecting to tax anymore. But let's say its real interest rate is higher than its real growth rate of GDP. So we say R is greater than G. The real interest rate it pays on debt is greater than G. Because inflation is 0, the real interest rate is the same as the nominal actual interest rate being paid. So the growth in debt implied by these assumptions is debt to GDP will grow to infinity. And the reason for that is every year it has to pay the interest on its debt. And because the interest is greater than the growth rate of GDP, the ratio of total government debt outstanding relative to GDP has to keep growing. It starts at 100%, it grows off to infinity. So that's how the arithmetic works. You look at the rolling over of debt, including interest payments, and you see very rapidly when a country gets to 100%, if its interest rates are greater than its growth rates, it's on an unsustainable path. Now, of course, in the case of the US and France, the problem is much bigger because they're not just on an unsustainable path because of interest rates. They're also on an unsustainable path because their future government spending is much greater than their government taxing. And so we know that they're on a very deeply unsustainable path. When you're on an unsustainable path, that means that the monetization of debt as a result of fiscal dominance is predictable. And so government has to change its policies. I'm not the only one to have done a lot of arithmetic on this. I published an article in 2023 in the St. Louis Fed Review showing, as many have before me, including the Secretary of the Treasury at that time, that current US spending on Medicare and Social Security and also on defense were producing predictable future deficits that will result in inflation rates that will be quite large. My back of the envelope calculation was that under current policy, if the US doesn't make the reforms pretty much immediately in the next several years, the inflation rate could be as great as 30% a year and would certainly be greater than 10% a year. So that's a big change for the US to have a permanent inflation rate of that amount. But the political challenge is you have to cut entitlements, that is Social Security, retirement benefits, and Medicare benefits. And you also have to curtail military spending at a time when the US is doing the opposite, mainly because of the China challenge. So the US has known about this unsustainability problem for decades, and yet it's done nothing about it. And so the question is why? The answer is politicians don't have an incentive to do anything about it because the electorate doesn't seem to care much about the problem. And so especially it's been surprising that young people don't care, because when this monetization problem happens, it's going to happen through a combination of some kind of real reduction in spending, so that their parents will have gotten huge benefits, but that they won't be able to get, and the big increase in inflation, which is associated with negative growth consequences. So why aren't young people in America part of a political movement to try to create immediate reforms in Social Security and Medicare to prevent inflation? We don't know the answer to that. We just know that maybe it's because they're ignorant of these costs. Most people aren't economists. But this is a great example of doing a little bit of thinking about inflation and its real causes leads you to a pretty scary conclusion in much of the world. I would say that applies to China, it applies to France, it applies to the US. How long will it be before the US has to face this problem through some kind of monetization? Well, that depends on how quickly the so-called vigilantes in the bond market sort of come to the conclusion that the government isn't going to fix the problem politically. So it's not something you can just solve as an arithmetic problem, because of course it's always possible that the government might decide to fix the problem so that the monetization could be avoided. So it's going to be a political judgment issue, not just a mechanical arithmetic issue. My own guess is it could be less than 5 years from now. So I think that unsustainability is not something for those young people who are younger than I am. It's pretty clear that you're going to see this happening, I would say, sooner rather than later. How do unsustainable crises usually play out in the markets? I mentioned this forthcoming book by George Hall and Tom Sargent before, and the answer from that book is that we tend to see, after debt balloons to unsustainable levels, we tend to see, perhaps surprisingly, bond markets tend to ignore the risks, as the current US bond market is currently ignoring the risks of this big fiscal shock. And then suddenly they react with very large, unanticipated, but you might say predictable, but still not anticipated by the market, very big sudden losses to the value of bonds. That's interesting because it tells you not to take any comfort right now from the complacency of the global bond markets, the fact that they're not pricing in this risk of a big fiscal shock being recognized in the debt markets. So I think that bond investors, for some reason, historically, have been unable to learn to anticipate the consequences of unsustainable accumulations of government debt. And that's the big lesson from this forthcoming book by George Hall and Tom Sargent. Note the inflation in the US is already sort of about 3%. Inflation expectations of consumers for the next 5 years are about 4%. There's already been a loss of credibility about this idea of Fed flexible inflation targeting with a long-run target of 2%. So the Fed has already lost that credibility. There's a lot of attention now about Kevin Warsh's likely appointment as chair of the Fed, and the question of whether Trump is interfering with Fed policy. And those are relevant short-term concerns. But I think what's so interesting is the more relevant medium-term concern is not about Fed's commitment or Warsh's commitment to returning to the 2% target, but really about the possibility of fiscal dominance, which is an arithmetic necessity of the current path of government policy. So the fact that government debt growth might dominate all of those other considerations about Warsh and the Fed and Trump in his dealings with the Fed. I think it's interesting how there's relatively little coverage of that risk relative to the sort of Fed policy decision risk. I find that really strange. Let's look at the next graph so you can get a sense of what people are saying about the current path. As I pointed out to you, typically a 100% debt to GDP ratio is typically viewed as a kind of critical crossing point where unsustainability happens. That is, if the real interest rate, I'll call it R star, is greater than G at 100% path, you're already on an unsustainable path. I would say that we're way beyond that. If you look at this graph, what you can see is plotting out to 2054, unless there's a change in entitlement spending. And by the way, this is not incorporating another likely influence, which is big, which is growth in government military spending. We can see we're already like pushing it up by 2054. We're approaching 170% debt to GDP. And a few years later, it crosses 200%. Of course, in my view, it won't get that high, because what will happen is we'll start monetizing even before, I would say long before you get to 170% debt to GDP. But as I said, that's a calculation the debt markets have to make about how far they go in believing that the government still might reform things. You don't just look at the current debt to GDP ratio. You have to look at your beliefs about future deficits. So, for example, France is in, I think, a riskier position than Greece. Greece has a higher debt to GDP ratio than France, but its deficits are on a negative trajectory, and so the debt to GDP ratio in Greece is falling predictably, and Greece is on a much stronger fiscal path, even though its current debt to GDP ratio is higher. The problem in the US and France is not just that cumulatively its debt to GDP ratio is high, but that its deficits on a forward-looking basis are quite large. Okay. Now, in the case of France, of course, what we're going to see is not clear. It's going to be an inflation problem. Notice the difference between France and the US. The US issues its debt denominated in dollars. France issues its debt denominated in euros. The US controls the printing press for the dollar, but France does not control the printing press for the euro. If you issue debt in a currency that you don't print, then an unsustainable debt buildup will lead to a debt default, not necessarily an inflation. And of course, that case was the Greek case after 2010. Note how quickly the Greek crisis and debt write-down that happened from 2010 to 2012 occurred once its debt accelerated above the 100% debt to GDP ratio, rising to about 130%. That was enough to create a debt crisis. So what about France today? With a debt to GDP ratio projected to rise to 125% by 2030, which is not very far away, France is clearly the weak link in the Eurozone. So now we have to ask some political questions. It's quite possible that within a few years, the market will conclude that France's debt to GDP ratio is unsustainable because of its lack of political will for fiscal reform, implying that it's on the path to maybe very soon a debt default. Now, what will happen? Will France get bailed out by Germany? Germany has a much, much lower debt to GDP ratio and does have the capacity fiscally to bail out France. Is that likely? Or is it possible that Germany might agree to allow all of Europe in the Eurozone to experience an inflation to bail out France that way, with the ECB buying French debt? Or will Germany, Italy, and others conclude to just allow France to have a default, like in the case of Greece? The problem, of course, is that they were able to assist Greece because it was a small country, and so its debt problem was small relative to the whole euro. France is another matter. It's one of the foundational and largest countries in Europe. This is a big issue for the future of the euro, and again, one that you don't see discussed very much. So when we're thinking about inflation risk for the developed world, we're thinking about a fiscal dominance problem that is gripping the US and that's extremely risky for the Eurozone, which could be risks in both cases that show themselves within the next 5 years. When we look at the history and the theories of inflation factors in emerging market countries, or let's say poorer countries that are developing and we hope are growing much faster, like Moldova, it's clear that their inflation histories are very different. Developing countries tend to have historically higher average inflation and much more volatile inflation. What's driving those differences in developing countries' inflation experiences? So the monetary system, the sort of shocks to the inflation process in developing countries, are operating under a different regime. Different banking systems, different international trade exposures, and often different fiscal policy environments. And it's all three of those factors that tend to have important consequences for the higher inflation risk in developing countries. So you'll notice, like Moldova in 2022, you experienced a jump in inflation to nearly 35% in 1 year. So that kind of jump and the higher average is actually not that unusual for developing countries. I'm not an expert yet, at least, on the Moldovan experience to be able to talk about the causal factors. Obviously, you all lived through it and you probably have a lot to say about that. But when I look at other countries, other developing countries for many years, they point to these three factors as generally driving the inflation experience of small, open, developing countries. So let me give you the list of these three factors. So first, constraints on fiscal resources tend to be a big problem. That is, underdeveloped countries tend to be underdeveloped in their tax collection apparatus. And that can be a very big problem because it means that they have to rely more on inflation taxation. This can sometimes take the form of what's called financial repression through the use of high reserve requirements on a non-remunerated basis, that is zero interest reserve requirements for banks. Through much of Brazilian history, Brazilian banks had to hold half of their deposit balances of their depositor customers in the form of non-interest bearing reserves at the central bank. And they were running a high inflation too. So that meant that just like cash in your pocket, the banks were experiencing big losses on those zero interest reserves. That was called financial repression because, of course, the banks, by having to hold government reserves at zero interest in the central bank, were not able to lend that money out because otherwise they would have been able to lend it to customers and earn interest on it. And that meant that the financial system, the banking system, was very backward and repressed. So that's in emerging market countries, a lack of tax capacity, which is really, you might even say, the defining feature of Brazil for its first 200 years of history, explains why Brazil was the highest inflation country in the world on average during those 2 centuries. Now, I note, by the way, I did some research to look at the Moldovan experience, and I thought it was interesting that reserve requirements in Moldova, while large, are also remunerative at pretty much close to, on average, market interest rates. So as far as I can tell, financial repression policies are not currently a problem in Moldova. I don't know enough about Moldovan tax resources, but I'm guessing that means that you're not facing this Brazilian problem that a lot of emerging market countries face of a lack of tax capacity leading them to rely on inflation taxes. A second influence of the three I want to talk about for emerging markets is a lack of export diversification. So you might say, well, why does that cause inflation? Because if you have a lack of export diversification, let's think about Chile, which is heavily reliant on copper, or Russia, that's heavily reliant on fossil fuels. Then when there's a terms of trade shock to the productivity of that one element. So a terms of trade shock means that if you're reliant on copper in Chile, when the demand for copper falls, that means your export productivity goes way down. Or in the case of, if you're an oil exporter, when the price of oil falls, that means your export productivity falls. When your export productivity falls, as I noted before, that tends to mean that you have a big pressure on your exchange rate to depreciate. So you will get an inflation just in terms of an export problem leading to exchange rate depreciation. But the problem can often be much bigger than that, because in a lot of developing countries, because of this disruption that comes to their exports and to making imports much more expensive, sometimes countries try to prevent the depreciation of their exchange rate through domestic expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. An example would be Mexico in the early 1990s. Because they want to stabilize the macroeconomic consequences of this negative supply shock. But that tends to be very destructive in the sense that you can't really use demand side policies to stabilize a supply shock, like a shock to export productivity. When you do that, you tend to produce much bigger depreciation ultimately when the exchange rate peg collapses, as in Mexico's case. And you also tend to produce now a very high domestic inflation coming from that monetary and fiscal policy expansion. But I want to emphasize, this is a very frequent problem that because emerging market countries are undiversified, they're very prone to big export productivity shocks, which it's tempting to try to offset with expansionary monetary and fiscal policy, which tends to result in a much bigger exchange rate depreciation and accompanied by now a domestic price inflation. The 1990s are full of examples of this, and they tend to also be examples of what's called twin crises, which are collapses not just in the exchange rate and big inflations, but also collapses of the banking systems. And the reason for that is that often the government policies that were trying to prop up the exchange rate and trying to keep the depreciation from happening also entailed providing a lot of subsidies through banking system credit. And when those subsidies fell apart, you got a twin crisis of big banking system collapse along with exchange rate collapses. The clearest example of that subsidization of credit leading to this twin crisis that I want to point to are the East Asian economies. That is the 1997 crisis of Thailand, South Korea, and Indonesia. If you look at, let's take the Korean case, there was slowing productivity growth in the tradable goods sector, resulting in a decline in global competitiveness in Korea, going back to the 1980s, that was visible when you did microeconomic analyses. But the government and the chaebols in Korea, the big industrial conglomerates, were very resistant to improving their productivity through market discipline. That is, these large Korean manufacturers had favored credit access because of their favored political positions with the government, which led them, even though their profits were disappearing, as their productivity was declining, it led them to use their access to credit to try to prop up these inefficient producers with subsidized credit. And that also meant that because they were continuing to produce, now the exchange rate was getting increasingly overvalued because of the lack of correction of the productivity growth problem. So in the Korean case, as the productivity growth in export sectors continued to worsen, again, partly reflecting that protected status of low productivity incumbent firms that enjoyed favored access to bank credit. The banking system also got further underwater because it had bad loans to those same protected enterprise. The government tried to maintain its exchange rate peg, but eventually this house of cards came down. And when it did, you had a domestic inflation, a big currency depreciation, and a complete collapse of the banking system, producing bailout costs for the Korean government of about 30% of GDP. If you look at the Korean crisis graph here, I'm just graphing it from the perspective of the exchange rate. That's the top panel here in the graph that's called Korean crisis graph here, if you could pull that up. So you can see there's a crawling peg through 1997 where the exchange rate is depreciating very, very little. And then you see the collapse where the exchange rate goes through a Maxim devaluation in 1997 and early 1998. So while it's been proven time and time again, you shouldn't try this sort of offsetting of productivity growth shocks. You should deal with them, allow the inevitable depreciation, and then you can avoid the big domestic price inflation and the big collapse of your banking system. That's a lesson that I hope was learned by emerging markets in the 1990s and early 2000s. By the way, the combination of this exposure to terms of trade shocks and the desire to try to offset those shocks through monetary and fiscal growth is not just a developing country problem. So let's look at developed countries. They were under a similar kind of policy mistake in the 1970s. When the oil price shock, the OPEC oil price shock hits in the 1970s, that is an adverse terms of trade shock for developed countries that were oil importers, like the US and Japan. The policymakers in those countries would have you believe, and it's a fatuous argument, that the increase in the price of oil was what caused the big inflation in, let's say, the US, the UK, and Japan. That's not true. And in fact, that illustrates the usefulness of Friedman's maxim that we said at the outset. It wasn't that the relative price of oil goes up and then inflation happens. That's nonsense. What happened was, just like in those emerging market country experiences, that developed countries, when they experienced a supply shock, they tried to offset it with monetary and fiscal expansions that produced domestic inflations and made their exchange rates depreciate all the more. So that it wasn't the oil shocks per se that caused the inflation. It was the fact that the countries tried to offset the supply shocks with expansionary monetary and fiscal policies. That's what caused the inflations. So that's quite similar to the emerging market experiences of Korea and Mexico. Okay, now I want to consider a third influence on emerging markets. I've already mentioned the influence of weak fiscal institutions, weak tax collection, to try to explain their higher average and more volatile inflations. So lack of fiscal tax resources, also lack of diversification of their export sector. The third thing I want to talk about is capital flows. So because developing countries tend to have smaller financial systems, capital inflows can be an important shock that can drive inflations. So capital inflows coming from the rest of the world can be very large relative to the existing central bank balance sheet and the existing domestic banking system balance sheet of these developing countries. An important implication of that is that these countries can't really manage their flexible inflation targeting the same way as developed countries do. And in order to explain that, and to explain the role of capital inflows as a potential source of inflation for developing countries, I want to talk about the case of Colombia in 2007 and 2009. So Colombia was not directly affected by the shocks that hit the US financial system in 2007 to 2009. It wasn't part of the US subprime real estate bubble, of course. It wasn't affected in any direct sense. Now, when the US experienced that crisis, the Federal Reserve cut US interest rates down to about zero. That meant that the interest rates in Colombia, which hadn't changed initially, now were relatively high, higher than the US rates. And what you saw happening was, as developed countries cut their interest rates to near zero, capital markets started reacting by sending resources to emerging market countries in what's called a carry trade, so that they could earn higher returns on their money in these higher interest rate environments like Colombia. Colombia experienced, therefore, very large capital inflows because foreign investors wanted to come to Colombia. Now, those capital inflows translate, if you do the accounting on the central bank's balance sheet, into big foreign currency accumulation by the central bank, which fuels, through increased reserves in the banking system, loan growth and deposit growth. And Colombia saw exactly that loan growth exceeding 20 percentage points per year. It also saw, as a result of these capital inflows, because that's a capital account surplus, a big current account deficit. And because the loan growth and the deposit growth was so large, you saw a big increase in domestic inflation too. So the initial response of the central bank in Colombia was to follow the books that central banks follow, which is contractionary monetary policy through increasing interest rates. Colombia tried to do this and in fact increased its target interest rate by 4 percentage points, which was a huge increase. But guess what? That made the capital inflow problem even worse because the carry trade incentives of foreign investors were to send even more money to Colombia. So this is really important. In a flexible exchange rate regime in an emerging market country, subject to really big capital inflows coming through the influence that I described, you can't tighten monetary policy just by increasing your interest rate. So what they did was the central bank and other authorities within Colombia coordinated a combined macro-prudential financial system response, raising bank capital requirements and loan provisioning requirements, raising bank reserve requirements, and imposing a special new reserve requirement on short-term capital inflows. This is known in Latin America as the encaje requirement, which succeeded in ending the capital inflow surge, resulting in reduced loan growth and inflation and allowing the Colombian economy to achieve a soft landing in 2008 to 2009, making its central bank head almost a national hero. So this example illustrates that monetary policy in small, developing open economies faces bigger shocks like those capital inflow shocks and also needs a broader monetary policy toolkit to deal with those shocks to prevent inflation from taking hold. So again, just to summarize, the three unusual shocks that emerging markets face that can explain their higher average inflation and higher variable inflation are more limited fiscal taxation resources, more undiversified exports, and smaller financial market and central bank size relative to the potential inflows coming from capital markets. So in conclusion, this brief summary I've given you in this lecture of inflation, the survey of the theory and the history of inflation, shows that a country's inflation experience is really best seen as a mirror of its political and economic institutional circumstances. Its political system making fiscal choices and having different kinds of fiscal resources, its level of, therefore, overall financial and fiscal development, its trade opportunities, all of those things factor into understanding why countries end up with different inflation histories. So you might say in that sense, the impression that one gets from the simplicity of Friedman's maxim can be misleading. Friedman's maxim is correct in a narrow sense, but it's largely empty, as most truisms are, in terms of its ability to help us understand a country's inflation experience. We need to go to other influences to understand that. Inflation's causes aren't always and everywhere the same or even similar. Differences across countries in their average inflation and its variation reflect those unique aspects of a country's history reflected in its economic structure and identity. So thank you for your attention, and we have time for questions if you're interested.
Thank you very much, Professor Kalomiris, for this path-breaking talk. I think understanding the pitfalls of policy and also how important fiscal dominance has been and can be when it comes to monetary policy is something that is very enlightening. So yeah, I would like to open the floor for questions that you can either post in the chat or you can basically also raise your hand using the function of Zoom, and yeah.
But Theochari, I'm going to let you be the one who sort of gives the questions. You can navigate it for me, please.
Okay, yes, I will.
Thank you.
So, Any questions, please? Yeah, I mean, I would like to open the floor to questions for the audience.
Guten Abend. I have one question for University Professor Friedman. Welcome in Moldova, in State University.
Thank you.
I have a very interesting and development question. What do you think about inflation and banking crisis in a Deutsch-speaking country? For example, German, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and other very developed countries. Thank you in advance.
Well,
Vielen Dank.
thank you. Thank you. Nicoletta, that's my godmother's name and also one of my daughters. Nicoletta is a name that I don't run across very frequently, so nice to have a question from you. So
I'm
I would
surprised
say
for this coincidence.
yes. So I think when you look at Germany, what's so interesting is, of course, they have only about a 50% debt to GDP ratio of government debt, owing to their sort of more conservative fiscal policy over recent decades than, let's say, France or Greece or Italy, which in the 1990s expanded its fiscal spending quite a bit and still is dealing with the historical consequence of that. Germany has avoided those things, but Germany is a Euro partner with France. And so that's what's so interesting. We haven't really had to deal with this political economy of exactly this before. What happens when one of the foundational countries of the Eurozone, France, loses its commitment to avoiding a fiscal dominance problem? And what will countries like Germany, which aren't facing any fiscal dominance problem on their own, what will they do? And so this is a political science question, not an economics question. How will the German electorate react to the idea of bailing out France, either with German direct subsidies to France, which would have to be huge, which would jeopardize its own fiscal discipline, or by allowing the European Central Bank to bail out France by creating a Eurozone-wide inflation? Those are the two answers. Which of those is likely? I don't know. I don't think either is very likely. So that means you might be looking at a collapse of the Eurozone, where Germany just decides to go back to the Deutschmark. I know that sounds very hard. You don't hear reporters talking about this, and you certainly don't hear ECB officials talking about it. But that's what's great about economics, is that when we see something that can't go on forever, we know it will end. So we're going to have one of four things must happen. The French have to politically decide very soon to make major fiscal reforms, or the Germans and others have to bail them out. I don't know, very hard to imagine how that could happen, because if these are permanent deficits, not just short term, or the European Central Bank has to decide to have a permanent rate of inflation that's very high, driven by the French deficits, or we have a collapse of the Eurozone, where basically France goes back to the franc and Germany goes back to the Deutschmark. What economics tells us is it's got to be something like that list. That's what arithmetic tells us. What politics tells us is which one.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So another question from the audience.
We have here.
Yes.
Just together?
Yeah.
This will be heard. Okay. Esteemed colleagues, distinguished professor, Mr. Calomiris, it was a great pleasure to hear today's lecture and, of course, to listen to your insight and informative forecast of the economic future of the world, Europe and Moldova. And my question will relate mainly to the current tendencies as far as we see the soaring prices on commodities and precious metals as gold, silver, and others. Also, the correction of price on these metals as well as on cryptocurrencies. So my question is, if we speak in terms of inflation, could it be the debasement of the currencies as the source of inflation, and especially in which perspective, and how do you see it for the future, and what would be your assessment of these trends? Thank you so much.
I think that the recent growth over the last couple of years in the prices of silver and gold are clearly telling us something about a loss of credibility with respect to inflation. I believe that it's mainly driven, though, in the market thinking by short-term considerations having to do with Fed inflation targeting that I mentioned before. The evidence for that is that when Kevin Warsh was nominated, who's considered the most inflation hawk of the four nominees that President Trump picked, that caused gold prices and silver prices to collapse within the day. Gold prices fell by more than 20%. Silver prices fell by 25%. Gold prices fell by almost 10%. So it was clear to me that the market wasn't thinking so much about the long-term fiscal dominance risk. It was thinking about the Fed, because it was the Fed appointment on that day that had so much effect. I predict, however, that I'm not trying to tell anyone to buy gold, but I have been thinking about buying gold as a fiscal dominance hedge for some time. So I haven't been in the market yet, but I think you're going to see, once you start seeing these government bonds prices falling, and people start understanding that there can be a collapsed government auction for U.S. treasuries, or a collapsed government auction for French treasuries. Once you start seeing that markets wake up a little bit and start thinking about not just very short-term kind of things, but, oh, wait a minute, maybe we're going to see a failure of the government bond auction, which has happened in the past, then the markets wake up very quickly. And you'll see yields on government bonds, of course, rising very quickly, and also things like gold and silver prices rising. So I do think that gold and silver has been rising because of inflation concerns, but I think they've mainly been driven by short-term fiscal things Fed things rather than medium-term fiscal concerns, which I think are getting too little weight in market thinking. Did that answer your question?
Yes, you did. I strongly agree with you, and thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, do we have further questions?
At least I have a few.
Yeah, I also have a couple. Yeah, Misha, you can start.
Super. So the first, as you know, we share that the new Minister of Finance has ambitions to write new fiscal codex, to make a big reform, and he's doing without any ideological or political views on it. But I will say it's quite right, and this is not common thing in the Moldovan political landscape, that some minister provides some right economic reform. So in current conditions, and due to the your not optimistic but realistic views to the EU zone, and take into account the situation in the region, Russian invasion to the Ukraine, low GDP growth of last years in Moldova, migration, that Moldova is a small country, etc. What's the main recommendation, in your opinion, for good tax reform for such country like Moldova?
I think that the key is that you have to be thinking over a medium time horizon, not just a short time horizon. So the real successful emerging market countries, I would say Chile most obviously, but then also, but let's talk about Chile. There are some other examples. You know, Chile actually implemented in the early 2000s a fiscal policy regime to try to deal with the inflation risks and other risks that are coming from its undiversified export sector. I don't know if that's as relevant for Moldova in terms of export diversification, but it was one of the things that got the Chileans to realize that they had to be thinking medium term about fiscal policy. So what they did was they actually created a regime that's really been, I think, a path-breaking idea that links their fiscal spending effectively to the price of copper. That says that when the price of copper is high, they need to be running fiscal surpluses because they know that there's going to be a time when the price of copper is low, when they will want to have flexible inflation policies supported by fiscal deficits. So what's been interesting about Chile is very much taking the theory and history that I just talked about of their own exposure to trade shocks to their fiscal policy needs, taking that seriously and institutionalizing it with a formula that says that they have to run surpluses during good times. So I think that, you know, the real key thing, I can't speak to Moldova because I don't know the Moldovan economy well enough to be an expert, to pretend to be an expert. But you have to think medium term, not just short term about the next election, and try to think about what's sustainable in terms of the kinds of tax resources that you need. And what's best is to try to make your fiscal policy subject to some kind of rule, some kind of medium-term rule that is going to allow you to credibly not overspend and drive yourself into this kind of fiscal dominance trap. So I think that that's really the case. I can't say that you are necessarily in the same position as Chile from the export non-diversification standpoint, but all of the emerging market countries, I think, can learn a lot from the Chilean experience to try to establish institutions, to create a political consensus for institutions that focus on medium-term objectives. And it's what's really important, what really leadership means politically, is to have the conversation about the medium term. That's also what Enrique Cardoso in Brazil did as president. He changed Brazil's inflation history by saying, look, all of you people know every politician who tells you he's going to solve poverty in 4 years is a liar. What we need to do is have programs that really can address poverty, but that have long-term horizons, like paying mothers to put their children into elementary school so they can learn. And in order to afford those programs, we can't waste money with giveaways that don't improve our long-term position. And by having that conversation in a realistic way and appealing to common people with realistic sort of understanding of fiscal constraints, he really was able to have a permanent positive effect in reducing Brazil's vulnerability to inflation, which he did in the 1990s. So I want to emphasize to political leaders, have the conversation, reframe the conversation as medium-term and long-term sustainability, and supporting fiscal programs that really address long-term growth of the country, not just political giveaways that are focused on the next election.
Yeah, seems it will be also not bad to have in Moldova some Chicago boys here.
Well, I didn't go to the University of Chicago, but I definitely see myself as a Chicago boy, so I'm happy to come. So I'm part of an alliance called the Alamos Alliance, which was founded by the Chicago boys. It's current. We meet once a year, usually in Mexico, to talk about what we can do to improve integration of the economies of Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and more generally, South America, to promote free trade and to promote market-friendly kinds of policies. A lot of this is what we're talking about, long-term horizons about fiscal policy, controlling the inflation process, good institution building on the fiscal side. So there is a large group still of, they don't really go by the name Chicago Boys anymore, of development economists, financial market experts that do confer and try to find good policy recommendations. I can speak to it certainly in Latin America. We have the finance ministers and central bank heads from many, many Latin American countries that participate in this annual meeting. It's sort of a secret meeting. No press are attending. Our deliberations are never covered or discussed, but it's a huge learning opportunity for many people. So I just wanted to tell you that while you may think of the Chicago Boys as a phenomenon of the 1970s, they still exist. And in fact, Al Harburger, one of the original Chicago Boys, still participates in our conference.
So we will try to use the opportunity to involve them in another Latin country, but not in America. So I have also another general question. Let's imagine, if Moldova will invite you like a chief economist of national bank, or let's say tomorrow we'll have resources to start a serious financial lab in Moldova School of Economics State University, and what list of research or indicators you will want to look, or what you will seek from the first day, and what you will want to research in the next period, also including the issues that Moldova face due to EU integration, etc., the context.
Yeah, and I haven't done enough of my homework to give you an intelligent answer to that, Misha, but I can say that obviously looking at what is the source of tax revenue currently, and is the existing source of tax revenue consistent with good long-term fiscal resources as well as conducive to growth? What kind of taxes are you relying on? Is the current tax system kind of a good, efficient system from a growth perspective? So that needs analysis I haven't done. I would also look at the banking system to see whether the banking system is disciplined in its risk management. Much of the world isn't. The US certainly isn't. I would say most of Europe isn't. There's too much of a protection of banks, which tends to create very poor risk management in the banking system. And as I pointed out, in emerging market countries, this is another area that can be extremely damaging, because the government can sometimes use the banking system as a political subsidy machine for insiders, which can be very damaging. I'm not saying you're doing that in Moldova. I'm just saying I would look at that. And I think that export diversification is an important policy. I don't know enough about your export sector to know if there's opportunity for improved export diversification, but those would be things I would look at. So, and of course, I think that flexible inflation targeting is the right policy for central banks. But I want to emphasize, if you don't have those other policies, flexible inflation targeting is doomed to fail, ultimately.
Thanks. We will try to use your advices. Tell.
Yes, I mean, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I have been thinking about the theory of fiscal dominance, and I want to basically ask, I mean, how different is it from what we know already, for example, from transition economics about soft budget constraints, right? Because, I mean, soft budget constraints, so bailout mechanisms that, I mean, this is from the micro perspective more, that give incentives for overspending, for example, to local governments. We have had this, I mean, I'm a student of Gerard Roland and Barry Eichengreen, so I'm going to ask you one question in both perspectives. So, I mean, this is more a Gerard Roland question in that sense. I mean, you are describing...
Yeah, I think that's speaking to the mechanism that can, from a political standpoint, result in the fiscal dominance problem. So, you know, in Argentina, when I was working there in the 1990s, the key reform that was needed was reform in the incentive structure of what was called the co-participation system, which was creating very bad incentives because the governments that were spending, the state governments were spending money that they were getting from the national government. So that was creating this kind of soft budget constraint problem. So yes, I think this is can be an important causal influence. So you need to have political structures that create the appropriate incentives to maintain the fiscal discipline. I think that's a really important. I would point to the Chilean experience that I mentioned before as a great example, because the key to the improvement in Brazil and in Chile was to have discussions about medium and long-term objectives, to take the political process away from just being about, you know, so it's partly integrating the different levels of government. That was a problem in Argentina, the co-participation system, but it's also about getting the election, the people to have a time horizon that goes beyond the next election.
Yes.
And also accounting systems can be very tricky. So when I was studying Brazil at the IMF in 1981, it was really strange because the Brazilian government was, in its accounting, telling everyone that it was running government budget surpluses. And that was just because they were just using lying accounting. So you have to also be very careful about what you believe coming from government accounts. The Thai central bank lied about its reserve position in 1997. The Mexican central bank lied about its reserve position in 1994. So there's another thing I would say that we've learned, which is you have to, when you're trying to understand these problems, be aware that governments are lying. And they especially lie about non-performing loans in the banking system. Typically, when a government's in trouble, the non-performing loans could be, as a percentage of total loans, 3 times what they're recognizing. When I was advising the Mexican government around 2000, at the Bank of Mexico, they showed me 3 different sets of slides. One, if you were a little honest. Well, one if you're completely lying. One if you're a little honest. One if you're completely honest. And so the fact that they had within their institution these different slides was itself quite interesting, right? So we all have to grow up a little bit in being a little more aware of what's the game that's being played in each country and what the tricks are and what the soft budget constraints are and what the lies are and what the incentives are. So you have to take and economists often don't understand the political processes of the countries that they're analyzing. So you have to be a little bit more grown up in your thinking to understand the real mechanisms that are driving these problems.
Thank you very much. And I have one more question regarding the role and responsibility of central banks. Does this theory of fiscal dominance basically take off some burden or some responsibility from what the central banks can do? Because, for example, I mean, the role of Mario Draghi, of the ECB, I myself also have written a paper about this. I mean, how, these liquidity bumps helped, for example, Greece and the southern European economies.
Sure.
and so on. So, I mean, so let's say that we have a central bank, we have a populist government and the central bank on the other side of the node. What can the central bank do? I mean, is the central bank hopeless or helpless in that sense when you have a populist government that, for example, wants to run high deficit policy without abiding by any rules?
So the way that I try to answer those questions is with scenario analysis, like I did in the case of France. Say, well, arithmetically, there are only 4 possibilities. Now you have to do the political analysis. How does it play out? What are the decision points? Who's making the decisions? What are their political incentives? So I don't pretend to know the answer, but I know how to get to the answer through that. So let me do a couple examples. Do I believe that if we hit a fiscal dominance point where the bond market wakes up in the US and concludes that adequate reforms are just not going to happen? By the way, I'm already there, but the bond market isn't yet. Then would Kevin Warsh, the inflation fighter, be able to resist? And the answer is no. Monetary powers, if you go and look at the US Constitution, are vested in Congress. The Fed is a creature of Congress. The Fed chairman can be replaced. They can amend the Federal Reserve Act. He doesn't have power that's unconditional. He only has power within the Constitution. And so if the president and Congress decide that they want to inflate and the Fed chair doesn't want to, well, first you replace the Fed chair. You might even amend the Federal Reserve Act, but you're not going to have a US government default on debt because that's the choice, right? Either the government defaults or the Fed monetizes. It's pretty obvious, given the Constitution, how that's going to play out. Now, in the case of France and Germany, it's much more complicated. But I can't really personally believe that Germany won't give France subsidies the way the southern European economies were helped because they were so much smaller, right, than the rest of Europe. Whereas now you're looking at a case where France is just too big to have that kind of assistance. And also, it's hard to imagine that the French political environment is going to be conducive to really draconian changes, like the kinds that happened in Greece eventually. And so I don't see the Germans seeing a path to providing direct fiscal subsidies. I think that they would also bristle at the idea that they would have a significant European inflation just to buy the French bonds, which is effectively another kind of bailout. So I think that there's going to be a very ugly scene where there's going to be a conflict brewing, that's already brewing, between, let's say, Germany and France over fiscal policy. And I think that this is what's going to be the really important news story of the next decade, maybe next 5 years. And the possibility that we go back to Deutschmark and Franc world instead of Euro world, I see as quite realistic. I'm not saying it's going to happen in 5 years, but it could. And I don't see how it gets solved unless now for the Greeks, once it became clear that the choice was having to exit the Eurozone and maybe even the EU, or be willing to do the things that were required, the Greeks were willing to do the things that were required, not initially, not when Syriza took power, but eventually. And they're still suffering a very low standard of living as a result of it, and they've lost 10% of their population. So it wasn't easy for Greece. Do I see France deciding to do that from their current sort of position? I don't know. I'm not an expert on politics of France, but my casual observation is it's going to be a very hard path. And the Germans they've been the careful ones. So from a fiscal standpoint, so this is going to be an absolute collision, but we need much deeper political analysis than I've offered here to come up with a good scenario. But that's how to do it. Recognize the problem arithmetically as an economist, and then do the political analysis.
Thank you. So do we have any further questions from the audience? If you have any questions, please jump in. I mean, we're almost ready anyway in terms of timing.
Yeah.
So I would like to thank Professor Charles Kalomiris for being such a wonderful speaker and interlocutor today in this first online seminar, research seminar of the Moldovan School of Economics. Thank you very much for being here.
So can I say that I was the inaugural seminar presenter? Can I say that?
Misa?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's how I'm going to list it.
Wonderful. So, Misa, do you want to take over and conclude?
May I ask a question?
Okay.
Hello.
Yes.
Thanks for a great presentation about inflation. So I'm interested. For instance, if we talking about some, let's say, investment activities, and we should think about inflation, right, for the same moment. So, what would be maybe good formula for inflation if we're talking about investment?
When you say investment, I don't know what you mean. Investment by whom?
Yeah, I mean, for example, if we want to invest in or put money in a bank account or invest in I don't know some let's say shares or gold, metals, and
Yes.
for the
You
same
mean if
time
you're
we should.
worried, if you're worried about inflation, what's the right kind of investment portfolio? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. We should also think about inflation rate, right?
Right.
And if we want to calculate it, what formula should we use for this?
So, I'll say some obvious things. One is whatever the interest rate is on an account, the nominal interest rate, the real rate of return is that nominal interest rate minus the expected rate of inflation over some relevant time horizon that the holder has to decide. So that's how you compute your real returns. And so you always want to make that. You don't want to suffer from what we call monetary illusion, which is to think that just because you're getting a higher return in nominal terms, you have to subtract off your expected rate of inflation. Notice I said expected rate of inflation. That's not so easy to calculate, but that's what you must do. You have to come to a judgment about what the inflation rate is over that horizon that's relevant for you. Secondly, what we've learned from history, of course, is that yes, gold and silver and other kind of stores of value, their demand for them will rise as a result of inflation too, globally. The third thing that we've learned is, let's say in the US experience, bonds are a terrible investment if you're worried about inflation risk. Stocks are an okay investment, but they're not perfect. And the reason for that is, the reason stocks are not a perfect hedge is that when inflation goes up, what we find in the US experience is stocks tend to also go up in nominal terms. They are partially a hedge against inflation, but not a total hedge. And the reason is that high inflation shocks tend to be associated with lower growth. And so when an inflation shock hits, if you just buy stock, which you might think, well, it's implicitly indexed for price changes, it doesn't really hedge against the inflation shock because part of the consequence of the inflation shock is reduced growth. So if you're worried about inflation in your country, then you might want to diversify with equities in other countries, as well as gold holdings. If you just hold equity in your country, the same inflation shock will tend to have reduced growth consequences for firms that will mean that equity doesn't really hedge fully against the shock. I hope that was an answer to your question.
Yeah, that helped me really. Yeah, thank you very much, Chad.
My pleasure. So thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. I hope that someday I'll be able to visit Moldova and help teach at the Moldovan school and be involved with this wonderful, exciting project. Good luck to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Professor Kalomiris.
Bye-bye.